Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Common Threads podcast. I'm your host, Kate Hall, and today we have an amazing guest, my friend Mitchell Price. Mitch grew up in St. George, Utah, and currently resides in Provo with his wife, Emma. He graduated from SUU with a degree in political science, and he currently works as a data content specialist at Ancestry, but is an aspiring environmental lawyer and an author. Thanks so much, Mitch, for being here. I'm so excited to interview you.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Kate. I'm glad to be here with you.
It's going to be awesome. So, I just kind of gave a brief intro to you. Obviously, there's so much more to you as a person. So, if you want to introduce yourself and tell everyone just a little bit about you.
Yeah, for sure. Like Kate said, I grew up in St. George, Utah, but my family actually moved there when I was about 10 years old from Colorado. I grew up in Aurora, Colorado prior to that, but consider St. George my home since, that's where most of my developmental years were spent. Uh, and yeah, right now I live in Provo. And as Kate said, I'm an aspiring lawyer. I'm studying for the LSAT right now. I'm taking that in September, hoping to go to law school next year or the year after so that I can eventually go into environmental law, maybe civil rights law. Those are a few things that I'm interested in. And then, yeah, I'm also a writer, working on a book. I've got a few short stories published online. And yeah, it's just, I guess, a little bit about me. I guess I just kind of said the same things you did, but yeah.
No, that was perfect. Thank you so much. So, I wanted to jump in just to some kind of like early childhood memories for you. So, you said you moved to Southern Utah when you were 10. And I've talked a lot about Southern Utah. A lot of my guests have been from there as well. But it's a very conservative place. And again, we've talked
Mhm.
about this before, but were you taught to be more sympathetic to those conservative views, or was your upbringing a little bit different than that environment that you were surrounded with?
Oh, I mean, yeah, that was absolutely my upbringing was, pretty conservative. Um, Growing up in Colorado, it wasn't necessarily what I was surrounded by in my community, but uh, those were very much the values instilled in my family life at home. My parents, the way that I was raised, and we never talked about politics much at home, but whenever it did come up, it was always very much from kind of a more conservative or Republican leaning point of view.
Gotcha. And you were probably super young, but do you remember in Colorado specifically, do you remember like anything clashing with what you're being taught at home and what you were seeing kind of out in the community or in school or anything?
Yeah, so during the 2008 election, um, when Barack Obama was elected to be president, I think most of the people in Colorado were pretty excited about that. Getting a Democratic president after years under the Bush administration, and Colorado is more of a blue state. But I remember distinctly a time where, and I don't have a lot of early childhood memories, just because I'm a forgetful guy, but I remember distinctly a time where we were driving down the road and saw a billboard or something, and people or on the radio talking about the election. Something brought it up to where I'm sitting in the back seat of the car, and I remember my dad starting to kind of talk about the Democrats, and to sort of say some negative things, nothing like super nasty or vicious, but that was obviously just not the side that he aligned with, and he had plenty to say about that. And that was the first time I recall really politics, realizing that politics was more than just, government administration, like these, the overlords of our country, for lack of a better term. My 9-year-old brain, that there were actually disagreements and that there were people who had one thing to say and others who had another thing to say. And that was sort of where I realized that, like, oh, it's a divisive thing. My dad is talking negatively about the person who was just elected to be president of the United States of America. And I didn't really understand why, but I guess at that time I began to maybe understand, like, oh, the Democrats are the bad guys, the Republicans are the good guys. And that was
Mm,
the way that I viewed it at that age.
yeah. Were your parents, you mentioned that they didn't talk a lot about politics growing up, but were
Mhm.
they politically active themselves, voting and being active?
Yeah, I think, they vote in every election. My dad was a police officer in Colorado, and so surrounded by a lot of, like-minded people who probably tended to lean Republican, just because, that's sort of the culture of police work. Uh, but aside from, his service toward the community as a police officer, I wouldn't say that my parents have ever really been super politically active.
Mm. And then, so you moved to Southern Utah, and again, you were probably really young, but do you remember seeing a shift in communities? Because it's very different from Colorado to Southern Utah.
Yeah, yeah, very much so. So, um, obviously, I grew up in an LDS family, Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for viewers who might not know what LDS means. And that religion is much more um, ingrained in the culture in Utah than it is in Colorado. This is kind of where the headquarters are. It's where a lot of members live is in Utah. And a lot of members of the church are also conservatively aligned or politically conservative. There's a lot of variation, I think, in how members tend to view politics, but there's definitely a trend. And so moving to St. George, it's a town in southern Utah, where most people, I think, are either LDS or conservative or both. Um, and so, yeah, it was definitely a cultural shift, but I think that made my parents really happy, uh, moving from Aurora, Colorado, to a place where their kids were now fully surrounded by people who were more like my parents.
Mm. Yeah, that makes sense. Definitely. I'm sure they felt kind of maybe not a stress in Colorado, but maybe like a little bit of a weight lifted off the shoulders that like their views and their beliefs were now going to be taught kind of everywhere you turn in southern Utah. And so, yeah, I
Yeah.
can imagine how that would feel. So moving into your middle school and high school years is kind of when people start to think more about politics a little bit and
Mhm.
start forming some of those ideas. Do you feel like this was kind of the same for you? Do you feel like that time was a little bit formative in those kind of thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. So I never, I think, as a little kid, my idea was, the Democrats are the bad guys, the Republicans are the good guys. But once I kind of got towards middle school, or maybe, even later on in, sixth, seventh grade, around that age, I started to realize that, it's not so black and white. And I had friends who maybe had come from liberal families and other friends who came from conservative families. And so I didn't see things so um, black and white or so objectively. And I started to kind of realize, oh, there's a little bit more to it than maybe what I grew up thinking. But I still very much was like, I have friends who may be kind of liberal, but I'm definitely not. I'm with the good guys still, right?
Yeah. Do you feel like there was a time where this maybe shifted for you? I know in your survey you mentioned you took like a political survey test, which I remember
Yeah,
taking that same test in high school to kind of see where you fall. And yeah, was
yeah.
this like a huge change for you?
It was a little bit of a shock to me because yeah, we took the political compass test in the class in high school, and I remember getting my results back, and it was telling me that I was, a little left of center. And I was surprised. I was like, no, I'm not. This is wrong. Like they got it wrong. Uh, that's not me. That's people dumber than me. Um, and but later that night when I went home, I went and pulled the same test up on my computer, and I read through all the questions more carefully because I was like, obviously I answered something wrong. I didn't understand what it was asking, but I read through it more carefully, and my answers didn't change one bit, based on what I had said earlier in the class with maybe more of a time constraint. And I was a little surprised because I was like, I feel like I understand what these questions are asking, and I understand how I'm answering them. And I'm answering them in a way that I view to be the most empathetic towards other human beings. And yet it's telling me that I'm left leaning. And there was just kind of a little bit of cognitive dissonance there. I was like, how could that be the case? If I'm viewing these questions critically and I'm understanding what they're saying and viewing this all through a lens of empathy, why would it tell me that I'm left leaning? And so I started to kind of realize at that point in my life that there is maybe some merit towards what the other side has to say.
Hmm. So I want to dive into that just a little bit. Did that make
Mhm.
you change anything about your life at that time or just have a different perspective, or was it more
Yeah,
impactful?
yeah, I think it mostly just changed my perspective. I was still in high school. Politics weren't at the forefront of my concerns. I was worried about grades and running cross country and track and trying to go on dates with girls. Like I wasn't thinking a lot about politics, but it did change my perspective a little bit to where I was like, okay, I don't think that there's necessarily good guys, bad guys, that there are just people who have different interpretations of how things ought to be done.
Mm. Did you talk with your parents at all about this test? I'm just curious if they were accepting of this
Um,
or if they weren't super excited.
I don't think I ever did. I can't recall ever having a conversation with them like that. Um, I think my parents are the kind of people who have their opinions that they're set in, but they are okay with me having opinions that are different and understanding of that.
Mm.
So I don't think that it ever would have caused any kind of major contention or anything. I think at best it would have, you know, my dad might have said something like, oh, you got to think about this again, think it through better, something like that. But no, I don't think it ever would have been like a contentious moment or anything like that. So,
That's good that they were kind of supportive of being open-minded and having different ideas. That's awesome. So moving on just a little bit, you graduated high school and then you moved to El Salvador for a couple years to serve
yeah,
an LDS mission, right?
yeah, exactly.
So what was that experience like being away from home for the first time at 18, 19 years old?
Oh man, culture shock to say the least. It's going from southern Utah, conservative desert town to living in the middle of the jungle in Central America. Yeah, a little bit of culture shock and San Salvador, which at the time was the murder capital of the world. Um,
Wow.
Obviously, that those statistics have changed a bit in recent years, which I can get into the reasons why. Uh, but yeah, it was scary, it was dangerous, it was shocking. But I loved the people there, and I loved what they had to teach me about the world. Uh, and it definitely, me being in El Salvador uh, during those formative years, during that time of my life, definitely influenced my political ideologies. Um, there were times where, walking through the streets in downtown San Salvador, coming across basically this large scale major homeless encampment out on the street, hundreds, if not thousands of people laying on tarps out on the ground, just, begging for food. And my companion and I, for listeners, all LDS missionaries are required at all times to be with a companion. And so, I was with another missionary. My companion and I, we start asking people, like, what they're doing out there on the street, like why they're there. And these people had basically all been forcibly removed from an entire apartment complex by the police force in El Salvador, which, at the time and probably still is very corrupt. very corrupt police force that, you know, would have the gangs in their pockets. And if the gangs need something, then the police make sure it gets done. And I started to kind of realize, like, oh, there's a lot of injustice around the world, uh, and beginning to start to see that back home as well, and I'd never seen anything like, a whole apartment complex or a whole group of people being forcibly removed from their living situation like that. But starting to realize the ways in which maybe the government doesn't always have our best interests at heart.
Mhm. So there's a couple pieces that I want to get into here, but first, and I know a mission like you're not really focusing on politics or the government, but
Yeah,
just curious, what were the political dynamics going on in El Salvador at the time that maybe you experienced? And you talked about a little bit the
yeah,
police force and everything, but just maybe some more insight for people who have no idea what goes on in El
yeah,
Salvador.
for sure. So back in the 80s, El Salvador underwent a civil war, where it was basically uh, leftist insurgents against the government. Um, and the United States, I learned on my mission, from talking with people who sometimes thought that I was, CIA or a government agent because I was a white boy walking around in a shirt and tie in El Salvador,
Yeah.
that the United States had helped prop up the Salvadoran government during the Civil War financially, with weapons and with currency, to fight against these, the socialist insurgents, basically the rebels. And realizing that a lot of people I talked to, because of that, did not have a super favorable outlook toward Americans. Obviously, that was, 40, 50 years ago. So things have changed, and people, I think, are generally much more accepting now. But I had a guy on my mission pull a knife on me once because he thought that I was a government agent who had sponsored, the right wing government during the Salvadoran Civil War. And I was like, dude, I wasn't even alive during that time.
Oh
I
my
had nothing to do
gosh.
with it. I'm just a missionary. But um, realizing that my government that I had always grown up viewing as kind of this gold standard, the United States of America is the pinnacle of freedom and excellence around the world, realizing that, oh, maybe not everyone views us the same way.
Hmm. That leads perfectly into my next question, which is when you got back home to the States, did this impact how you saw politics and how you viewed the government?
It did. I think I started to look at everything with a more critical eye, and um, I wanted specifically to examine how government propaganda might have influenced my life. Uh, and realizing that it's okay for me to change my beliefs with additional information. That, maybe I take a political compass test that tells me I'm left leaning, and to maybe actually let that affect me and change me, or maybe to see how my government has harmed or cast aside certain underrepresented groups throughout history and through, our modern day, and maybe why I shouldn't always believe when people say that there's nothing wrong with it.
Mhm,
And yeah, and that thought intrigued me. Was, I want to have all the information that I can, and to then make my decisions from there. And so I started learning more about politics a lot more when I came home from a mission. And I even, went to SU and decided that I was going to major in political science.
mhm. So just one more question, from your mission experience, and then we can move
Yeah.
to, going to college and and SUU and everything, but just
Mhm.
we kind of talked about the broad idea of your political beliefs and seeing like the government in a more broad lens. But while you were in El Salvador, did you have any experiences that specifically impacted like very specific political beliefs that you had? I don't know if that question makes
Yeah,
sense, but
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so I was there um, during the presidential election year when Nayib Bukele was elected,
Mhm,
he's still the sitting president of El Salvador. Um, and I wasn't following it closely because I was worrying about other things, worrying about missionary things at the time. So I wasn't really paying attention to the election. But a lot of people were talking about it because it was a hot topic. Because here was this new guy who wasn't aligning himself with either of the major political parties in the country. They weren't so different from us where they had two major political parties, and this guy was not a member of either one. He came in with his own party that he created and said, "I'm going to change everything." And he had a very populist approach uh, to his campaign and promising that he was going to root out the corruption, he was going to root out the gangs and toss them all in prison at whatever cost.
mm,
And those who have followed Salvadoran politics over the last few years, or even U.S. politics this year, know that uh, that did happen in El Salvador over the subsequent years. People, their right of habeas corpus, which is basically the principle that um, people are allowed to have a trial if they are charged with crimes. That's a very basic way of putting that, but that's basically it. That right was revoked in El Salvador so that they could round people up off the streets, herd them into prison, and throw them in there for as long as they want without giving them a trial date. Um, and did it clean up the streets in El Salvador? Absolutely, it did. But I think I saw something that kind of scared me about that, which was how far can we take eliminating our civil rights and liberties for the sake of safety? You know, where do you draw the line? Like, yeah, there's less murders, there's less gang violence happening in El Salvador, but there's also less rights, less liberties. And the Constitution was basically crumpled up and thrown in the garbage. And it reminded me, and I'm not trying to make a comparison between Nayib Bukele and Adolf Hitler, but it reminded me of some things that had happened in the 1930s in Germany, where rights were being taken away from groups of people by a populist political leader who was promising to make and institute widespread change um, under the banner of his new party. And brings me to, I see a lot of other similar things like that happening today in our country, in America. Uh, you know, Populist president who, yeah, didn't technically create his new political party, but um, let's be honest, MAGA isn't necessarily the conservative Republicans that we knew of 10, 15, 20 years ago. And implementing widespread change, taking away constitutional freedoms for the sake of what some might view safety.
mhm. That's a really interesting and thought-provoking conversation, and it's kind of ironic that we're talking about this right now. I saw a post on Instagram today, and it was this very same concept of like safety versus civil liberties and
Mhm.
which one is more important and in which situations do we prioritize one over the other. And it was something that I haven't really thought about before. And so it's really interesting that we're having this conversation. It's yeah, it's making me think. I'm sure people who are listening to this are also considering it too. But yeah, it's a really interesting conversation. And yeah, I just It's cool to have your perspective being in El Salvador and experiencing
Mhm.
this like while it was happening and then seeing it unfold now with our current administration. So,
Yeah.
okay, shifting to you got back from El Salvador, you moved to Cedar City, Utah to
Mhm.
attend SUU. Was that always the plan? Did you always want to go to SUU, or was there kind
Um,
of like a path you took to get there?
there was a brief time when I got home from my mission where I thought about transferring up to BYU, as I think a lot of recently returned missionaries from the LDS Church tend to do, because um, BYU is a private church-owned institution, so I think that there's some appeal there for a lot of returned missionaries. But I had a full tuition scholarship offer at SUU. And I went there for a semester thinking if I don't love it, then I'll transfer. And after a semester, I loved it. So I was stuck there for the next 4 years.
It's such a great place. I don't know if you know Lawrence Mbaki, but I interviewed him a
Oh
couple weeks
yeah,
ago, and we talked about how awesome SUU is and go
yeah.
T-Birds, and yeah, it's just a
Oh,
great place to be.
he's such a good guy. Yeah.
Yeah, he truly is the best.
Mhm.
So you studied political science. Was
Yes.
this always something that you wanted to study, or was this kind of something you discovered about yourself in college?
Um, that's tough to answer because um, in growing up in the LDS Church, members are used to receiving blessings from priesthood leaders. And one of those blessings is called a patriarchal blessing, uh, which basically is, the idea of it is to kind of help give you an outline for your life. That's a really simplified way of explaining it, but for the sake of time, that'll do for now. And there were comments made during that blessing that I received when I think I was 17 when I got it, maybe 18. It's right before I left on my mission, so I was 18. Uh, Specifically about politics and about my ability to defend people's rights
Hmm.
that I had never really thought of before. It was like, defend people's rights. Like, what? That, that doesn't sound like me, but it sounds cool. And so I think that that to me sounded a lot like a career in law, specifically, defending rights. And so I thought a lot about law, and that I think is kind of what led me to political science. Is That's sort of the starter kit for pre-law students, right? Is political science and understanding how our legal system works. So that was kind of what drew me towards that initially, I think. But um, this this trend that I was going through at the time, which was re-examining my own political beliefs and understanding how important different ideologies actually are in influencing the way that people live their lives, led me to want to explore that further. And so uh, it turned out to be kind of the most natural path forward for me at that time.
That's really cool. Do you feel like that religious experience kind of nudged you in that direction and you were like not thinking about it at all, or was that kind of something that you had already considered? I don't know. Did it just come out of the blue and you were like,
I
you know
think
what? That actually sounds good.
I think that was the base of the building blocks for me. Um, but I do want to clarify that I don't think I would have studied that had I not wanted to. I don't think I would have been like, oh, but I, received this counsel or this blessing when I was 18 that leads me to think this, so that's what I should do. No, it was a personal decision that I made, but that was maybe a point in my life where I realized like, oh, it is more important for me to start thinking about these things seriously. So,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm curious to know if there were any experiences that you had while in college that kind of shifted your thinking politically.
Yeah, so I'd say I went into college thinking I knew what politics were about, but not really understanding a thing still. I kind of had these, small ideas, but I was like, oh, I'm not like my parents. I'm a liberal now, and that's how I started college. That's how I came home for my mission, which I think is different from a lot of people who come home for their missions who tend to um, maybe feel a little bit more politically conservative. That's at that time I was like, no, I'm a liberal now. Like I'm different. Uh, but I think over the next year or two in college, as I learned more about politics, it kind of brought me more towards what I would say was a center point, and I would describe myself to people as a moderate, which looking back was a way of saying like I actually don't know what I think.
Mhm.
Um, but yeah, in the summer before my senior year of college, I went and did an internship in Washington, D.C. at a lobbying firm that specialized in financial services. And it was a bipartisan firm, um, but most of the events that I would attend, most of the work that I would do for clients was very much, um, it was on the Republican side. Most of the members of Congress that we hosted fundraisers and dinners for were Republicans, and most of the hearings that I took notes for and attended were obviously all hearings in Congress are bipartisan, but they were. I went with the intention of explaining how this might hurt the Republican point of view, and that was what I was to report on for our clients. So
Mm.
I really liked that internship. I had a good experience there, but the more I kind of interacted with people who were on the right, and the more I dived deeper into these issues, specifically economic issues, the more I started to realize like this is not how I think at all. Um,
Mm.
and I don't know if it works for me anymore to remain undecided, to try to gain all this knowledge, but say, oh, every side has merit. Like, no, I just don't think like this. And I think that, I'm a little bit more over here to the left. So that was, yeah, I think an important experience in sort of defining my political ideology, helping get it to the point where it's at today.
Yeah, definitely. Do you feel like being surrounded by a lot of conservative people, was that, kind of hard for you? I know, like, I work in state government, and I'm not a Democrat, but I'm very middle, and I still have a hard time sometimes
Mhm.
being surrounded by a lot of conservative people. Was that kind of a really difficult time? And maybe, like, how did you balance that with being surrounded by that, but also having these other feelings?
Yeah, was it really difficult? No, because it's kind of what I was used to. I grew up in Utah, and with conservative family members, conservative friends, um, very much used to it, and used to kind of biting my tongue sometimes when some people are talking. I've stopped doing that as much now, because now I think I'm a little bit more radicalized than I used to be. But uh, I think it was very easy for me to just compartmentalize and say, you do your thing, I'll do me, and that's okay.
Mhm. So you've talked about wanting to become a lawyer, and
Mhm.
you're currently studying to take the LSAT, which is so exciting. Um,
Super exciting.
yeah, that test is brutal, I've heard.
Mhm.
But you mentioned you wanted to be either an environmental lawyer or a civil rights lawyer. What made you decide that those were kind of the two focuses that you wanted to study?
That is a great question. So, after graduating college, I went through a little bit of a career identity crisis. I think most people do right after they graduate college, um, where I said, "Oh man, I was planning on going to law school. Do I actually want to go to law school? I don't know. It sounds pretty dang tough, and maybe I can get a job in politics or in the legal field some other way, go get a master's degree in public policy or public administration or something like that. Um, but if I want to decide or know that that's really what I want to do or not, I guess I'd better get some experience. And so I looked for jobs at law firms, and I ended up getting a job at a law firm in Utah County called Atomic Workers Claims. And this law firm, uh, their whole niche was helping former nuclear weapons production workers file claims to the U.S. Department of Labor to receive medical benefits as a result of toxic or radiological exposures that they may have been subjected to while working at these sites. So people building nuclear bombs for the government um, who were oftentimes um, unjustly subjected to radiation exposure, to asbestos exposure, all these horrible things that are cancer causing uh, without the proper protection or without their knowledge. And so helping them file claims to get money and to get their medical needs covered. So
Mm.
um, I and I really liked that job. There were things I didn't necessarily love about the way the office was run, but doing the work where I was helping people who had been wronged by their government to be righted by their government was very fulfilling for me at that time. And I kind of started to think more critically about the way that the government kind of has this sort of very lax approach to handling natural resources and to handling uh, different substances. And that sort of led to me thinking more about energy policy, thinking about fossil fuels, thinking about nuclear energy, and deciding that those were all very, very important issues to me. And I grew up as a hiker, as a runner outside. Like I love being outside. I'm a big time skier. I love snow. I love the mountains. And so I already had this huge backdrop in my life of loving the outdoors, of loving the earth, loving nature, and seeing how climate change was affecting our earth, how it was affecting our country, and how it was affecting individuals sort of led me towards that path of, maybe environmental law would be something for me, whether that's being engaged in advocacy to institute new laws that would place stricter standards on our government to slow the spread of climate change, or even, helping corporations comply with federal regulations in the environmental sector. So yeah, it seemed like something that I could live my life being passionate about, and that's what I wanted to do.
That's super cool. I'm so glad that you found something that you're really passionate about and really interested in. And yeah, all of those things sound really cool. So I'm excited to see where you go in law school and see what you end up studying. But um, you also mentioned you want to be a writer. So,
Yeah,
and that you're writing a book right now. You have some short stories. So, what type of writer are you currently? What are you working on? Yeah, give us a little plug into who you are as a writer.
yeah. I mean, this is I I've always just loved writing. I used to just write little stories for fun that I would never share with anyone. Anyone. You could not convince me to. But um, recently, I decided that I think that the act of creation or engaging in creating art is an inherently revolutionary act. I know that sounds weird, but um, I, I, I've been having so many thoughts lately about how capitalism can kind of subdue our creativity and how this world that we're living in is so gray. It's so bleak. It can be depressing at times. I talked a little bit earlier about our current administration, and I think it's very fair for me to say that I am not a fan at all of, Donald Trump or his administration or his approach. And I think that creating art on our own terms and using our own voice is a great way to spread principles with people in a way that they might not otherwise be able to reach them through. And so, yeah, I write stories, I write books. Not all of them, are political, but uh, some of them are. And a novel I'm writing right now, kind of one of the major themes of it is colonialism and uh, class revolution in society. So uh, I write, mostly kind of sci-fi fantasy is the genre. Um, and I would love to publish my book someday, maybe get a little bit of income that way. Uh, who knows what'll happen, but I do think that creating art is an important way to share ideologies and principles with people.
I think that's so powerful and so beautiful. And yeah, let us know if you publish that book. I'll buy it and we can plug it here on the show. And yeah, it
Awesome.
it all sounds awesome. So
I'll get you a
I'm
signed
so excited.
copy.
Oh my gosh, wow, that's the dream. That's huge. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I wanted to shift into some more specific political views, and you
Yeah.
kind of already touched on this a little bit, but do you align with a specific political party? Do you still feel like you're kind of in the middle but left leaning, or have you officially identified with the Democrat Party or a different party?
Yeah. So I would still consider myself an independent. But I think a lot of people hear the word independent and they assume that that means kind of in the middle. But for me, at the point I'm at in my life, um, it's because I've moved further left than the Democratic Party has in America.
Gotcha,
Um, and I would consider myself probably more of a leftist, um, with liberal takes.
gotcha. Do you feel like this specific label or identification impacts your life at all?
Um, I do because um, it's hard to answer why, but I think that it's important for me to engage with like-minded people, people who understand me. Uh, and I think that it's becoming more common in America. Maybe this is just in my little small circle or my echo chambers that I'm a part of, but I think it's becoming more common in America for people to be frustrated with the lack of initiative in the Democratic Party. I think that there's a lot of promising things that they have to offer for Americans that Republicans are actively opposed to. But there's just not a lot of action being taken. And at the end of the day, these kind of feel like empty promises made to keep voters voting. And the people that I find I most closely identify with in my life are people who have kind of come to that same conclusion about the Democratic Party is that, yes, they are closer than the Republicans by a long shot, but they're not fully there. And that there's really not a lot of influence in our federal government or even in state and local politics. Uh, People advocating for widespread social reform or healthcare, education reform, all these things that people are becoming more attuned to, at least the people that I seem to talk to.
Mhm. No, I think there are a lot of people who are sympathetic to those views. I mean, it's bringing back to Cory Booker's speech this last week, just like
Mhm.
saying exactly that, calling out Democrats for not acting and not putting in enough effort and enough action. And so, yeah, I think a lot of people are in your same shoes and might be frustrated. with both parties, but that one specifically. So, because of this specific identity and all the lived experiences that we've talked about today, what do you feel like you are most passionate about politically?
Um, yeah, so I mentioned already environment and climate change. That's a huge issue for me. Um, I was just reading something today about what the world would look like if the average global temperature were to increase by just 4 degrees Celsius. Uh, and it's bleak. Anything, within several thousand miles of the equator would basically become uninhabitable, and everyone would be forced to live in, uh, the northern reaches of Alaska, Canada, Russia, uh, because those would be the only places that would be habitable. Situation like that is obviously terrible for the Earth, for the world that we live in, but it's also scary for America because that would turn Russia into the global superpower, uh, which obviously has implications that can be a little scary for people who are a fan of civil liberties.
Mhm,
Uh, but yeah, climate change I think is kind of the most apocalyptic and terrifying thing that we have to deal with, um, followed closely by rising fascism, which is the other issue that I would say I feel most passionately about right now is protecting people's civil rights, protecting liberties, and resisting authoritarian or autocratic takeovers of our government.
mhm. Thank you for sharing those experiences and everything we talked about today. Just shifting into some final thoughts, what do you hope that people take away from this interview?
Um, I For any viewers or listeners who might feel betrayed by what's happening in the government currently, in our government, or anyone who's maybe on the fence, on the line, I would urge you to kind of take a look into more progressive policies and to realize that what you may have grown up or may have seemed to be these triggering buzzwords, like socialism, like leftism, uh, diversity, even, which is a huge buzzword right now for some reason, uh, that these things are necessary for the progression of society, that there is no world in which we can improve our society and create more equitable and equal opportunities for everyone, regardless of race, gender, regardless of religious beliefs, anything, without implementing progressive policies and without doing it fast.
What do you wish that people better understood about you and others who see the world similarly to you?
Yeah, I I think that people can have a tendency to look at someone like me, um, a straight, white, cisgendered Christian guy, and make an assumption, um, usually that I would be, conservative, that I would be a Republican, whatever it might be. Um, and I think that I would want people to understand that yes, those kinds of identities can be important for people. Race, gender, religion, all of those are important things to a person's like individual identity, but you can't fully know who someone is or what they believe until you get to know them. And I think that that's something that a lot of people on the right tend to forget, um, and tend to avoid is getting to know people who are different from them. And so I would just, yeah, I would want everyone to really sit down and have honest conversations with one another about what it is you believe and why we kind of all have the same goals ultimately at the end of the day, but only some approaches are going to get us to those goals realistically.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that. Sitting down with people and having real and honest conversations. And yeah, just reminding ourselves that there are people on both sides who, I mean, everyone wants this country to succeed. Everyone wants
Mhm.
people to be happy and to live good lives. And it's just, yeah, it's like, how do we get there? And I think we lose sight of that. And so, yeah, thank you for reminding everyone about that. Any parting thoughts before we wrap up?
Um, yeah, I know I've yapped a lot already, and I should probably shut up, but um,
You're totally fine.
just don't listen to the bullshit that Donald Trump spews from his mouth. Just don't do it. Just that man is a narcissist, a liar, and we should all be doing anything we can to avoid letting him take any more power than he already has. That's kind of bottom line for me.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, anything else you want to share? Any last stories? Yeah, otherwise we can wrap up.
That's good for me, and you can cut that last part if you if you want, But
No,
um,
no, I
I
think it's good.
I'm yeah, I was happy to be here and to chat with you, Kate. It's always good catching up with you, and um, I hope that people can listen to what I or anyone has to say with an open heart and mind. So, thank
Yeah.
you for having me.
Thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a really fun conversation to have.